medieval Gospel of Barnabas and the Christian Esoteric tradition. First, what is the Gospel of Barnabas? Well, there are, or were, two such books. There was an ancient work called the Gospel of Barnabas. It's listed in two documents among banned books. It was excluded from the biblical canon and anathematized. It's not survived. In fact, no part of it has survived. This allows some to argue that there was no such book, but I think the evidence strongly suggests there was. We have no idea what it contained, except that the church disapproved of it. There was a proliferation of such early Christian Gospels. Only 4 of them were accepted and made it into the canon. The rest were suppressed. It seems a Gospel was written under the name of Barnabas. We know nothing for sure about it. We can guess from the context, though, that it was very likely too Jewish Christian to be Orthodox. That is, it favoured retaining aspects of the old law and presented a more Jewish Jesus than Orthodox portrayals allowed. Barnabas, according to Christian tradition, was a Jewish elder among the party of the circumcised, with tensions with Paul and the Gentiles. The other Gospel of Barnabas is a medieval or early modern work surviving in Italian and Spanish texts. It seems to be the work of a Christian convert to Islam, an apostate, for it presents Jesus as foreshadowing the coming of Muhammad. It is explicitly Islamic. It is not the ancient Gospel of Barnabas. Who wrote it? We don't know who wrote it, or perhaps we should say who assembled it, because it is clearly a composite work stitching together material from several sources. Who composed it? Who stitched it together? We don't know. I don't think we can even hazard a guess, and we may not ever know. But he wasn't a literary genius. It's not a great work. And he didn't know Islam very well, and it would seem the Quran not at all. The author is a renegade. The work is both an endorsement of Islam and a rejection of all the norms of Christian orthodoxy. It is a work of Christian-Islamic polemic. The author, it seems, has embraced Islam and has reimagined the Gospel of Jesus from that viewpoint. Who was he? We don't know. Where did the work come from? There's a preface to the Spanish text. It claims that a certain Fra Marino, a brother Marino, found it in the library of Sixtus V, Pope Sixtus V. This is the explosive claim made in the preface. The first actual notice of it, though, is somewhat later as a curiosity among book collectors. It wasn't found in the library of Pope Sixtus V. The preface is a fiction. We are not sure of its movements, but it ends up in the hands of Protestants and freethinkers who, even then, don't quite know what to make of it. The preface, we can say, has been added to the text in order to attach certain names to this heretical work. We have the work, it has survived, because it was leaked by the Inquisitor, Giulio Santorio. This is a very complex story. Santorio didn't write the work, or have it written, although he added the preface. The preface names names. By following those names, we can work out much of what happened. Why would Cardinal Santorio do this? His enemies had just cheated him out of the papacy. In the conclave of 1592, Santorio came within a single vote of being elected pope. His enemy, Marcantonio Colonna, the papal librarian, and Ascanio Colonna, his brother, both cardinals, voted him down. They betrayed Santorio in the conclave in a very famous and controversial event. We have accurate accounts of it. The votes were tied. Ascanio had the deciding vote. He was aligned to Santorio. But dramatically, at the last minute, Marcantonio gave his brother a slip of paper, a note. Ascanio read the note and then cast his vote against Santorio. Betrayed, Santorio then prepared the Gospel of Barnabas with a preface to incriminate the Colonnas, along with a circle of their associates. But the Gospel of Barnabas must have been a pre-existing work. Santorio took this exceedingly heretical book and weaponized it against the Colonna. This is why it has survived. It was in the possession of the Inquisition, and Cardinal Santorio leaked it in a conspiracy to incriminate the Colonna and others in heresy. And not only heresy, treachery. They were accused of being a nest of sympathizers for the Turks, secret Saracens, double agents, apostates. But the Gospel of Barnabas must have already been written for some other purpose. Santorio has recast it to use against his enemies. What other purpose might it have been written for? The notice that it answers to is in the 5th century apocryphal book called the Acts of Barnabas. It's very important to realise this. A forger needs a gap in the literature to fill. In this case, the Acts of Barnabas speaks of Barnabas travelling with a, quote, narrative of miracles and doctrines, unquote, given to him by Matthew. The medieval Gospel of Barnabas seems to have been written to fill that notice. It is supposed to be the narrative of miracles and doctrines mentioned in Acts of Barnabas. That is, it has been composed in order to participate in Barnabean traditions. It is Barnabas literature. There is a developed tradition surrounding Barnabas, just as there was surrounding all major figures in the New Testament. The Acts of Barnabas recounts his supposed travels and biography. That work says that Barnabas travelled with certain books. The medieval Gospel of Barnabas has been forged to pose as one of those books, the narrative of miracles and doctrines. Where? We cannot be sure, but the centre of the Barnabas tradition was in Cyprus. The tradition is that Barnabas went to Cyprus and died and was buried there. He is the patron of the Cypriot Church, which has preserved Barnabean traditions and relics. But Cyprus fell to the Turks after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This was a great historical and geopolitical watershed. The context of the medieval Gospel of Barnabas seems to be the aftermath of that watershed. When Cyprus fell, the Barnabean tradition relocated into Christendom, and specifically to Milan. The Milanese church also took their apostolic authority from Barnabas and had long contacts with the church in Cyprus. There had been a transfer of relics and other links. After the Battle of Lepanto, there was an influx of Barnabean material into Italy as the Cypriots fled the Turks. This is all important background. Even though we cannot say who wrote the Gospel of Barnabas, where or exactly when, we can establish this background and place it in a meaningful context. There are other theories, but the preface provides the clues we need. The preface clearly points to a certain scenario involving certain people. The supposed author is clearly Mark Antonio Colonna. He is called Fra Marino. This was a nickname given to him by Pope Sixtus V. The ancestral home of the Colonna is the village of Marino. There is a church of St. Barnabas there, and in front of that church there is a fountain with sculptures depicting the Battle of Lepanto. We can be absolutely sure we have made the right identifications. The best surmise is that the Gospel of Barnabas was written in Cyprus, or was assembled from materials written in Cyprus. It is in that case a heterodox product of the Barnabas tradition in the Church of Cyprus. Some of the constituent material points to this. Some of it, whole slabs of it in fact, is clearly under Carmelite influence. The Carmelite monks had earlier relocated from the Holy Land to Cyprus. The Carmelite influence in the work points to Cyprus. It came into Europe, to Italy, to Milan, when Cyprus fell to the Turks. But was this work already a Muslim gospel when it came into Europe? It is hard to say, but it seems unlikely. Some people think the work is Islamic to the core. I disagree. It is material that has been reshaped into an Islamic form. This was probably done late in the piece, if not by Santorio himself. It has been recast as a Muslim gospel, but the constituent components of it were not originally Islamic. The big slab of Carmelite material wasn't originally Islamic. It has been repurposed, refitted into a pro-Muslim form. This is very clear. Can we see what it was like before it was repurposed as a Muslim gospel? Yes, we can. For instance, the first 10 chapters constitute a separate source. It is a medieval infancy narrative. The Carmelite material is a set of stories about the sons of the prophets. None of this is explicitly Islamic. More interesting, there is a large body of material in the work that is set on the far side of the Jordan River, the Transjordan. This wasn't originally Islamic either. It was originally a text concerning the teachings of John the Baptist. Someone has taken this material, taken these component parts, and woven them into an explicitly Muslim gospel. All of this suggests that the author was an adherent of the Barnabean tradition, either in Cyprus or in Milan. What was the author before he shifted his allegiance to Islam, is the question. Perhaps a wayward Carmelite monk. That would be a good guess. But certainly someone whose spiritual life was in the Barnabean Cypriot tradition. This is what the extant material points to. We must imagine that someone in Cyprus, steeped in the Barnabas tradition, decided to join the Turks rather than fight them or flee. That scenario would fit the existing document. Was an earlier or ancient Gospel of Barnabas among the materials used to construct the medieval work? Possibly. The existing work is constructed around a pre-existing gospel narrative. Big slabs of other material have been loosely attached to this narrative. The narrative itself is very likely some version of the narratives of miracles and doctrines mentioned in the Acts of Barnabas, as I've already explained. But it was, in any case, a gospel harmony, a diatessaron of some sort. The core of the work, the thing that gives it structure, is a gospel harmony. This, or parts of this, might be quite old. It is probably not ancient in itself, but it may have ancient roots. Are there any signs of ancient material in the medieval work? None for sure, but there is much that is tantalizingly suggestive. The reconstructions of the gospel narrative and the extra-canonical episodes described in the work are fascinating and often have ancient reflections. For example, at one point, a massive war breaks out over the question of who and what Jesus is. There is a huge Christological war involving armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The story is that Jesus so confounded people that it led to a huge war. This is surely a reflection of the Jewish war. There are textual signs that the account depends upon Josephus. There are many such curiosities in the medieval Gospel of Barnabas. How should we think of such a work? First, it seems to be a type of preservation document. The author has used extraneous amounts of material. It is very big, because he wants to include such materials despite the fact it bloats and distorts the gospel narrative. There is material he wants to preserve. There is even a whole document embedded in the text, the Little Book of Elijah, which is a short monastic rule, clearly a separate composition. The author wanted to preserve it. The Gospel of Barnabas should be seen as a preservation document. Second, the extant text in Italian and Spanish should be seen as Inquisition literature. The preservation document has been prepared as Inquisition literature. These texts were prepared by Santorio to be used against the Colonna. It was routine for the Inquisition to forge or fabricate letters and documents to be used in inquisitorial trials to ensnare heretics into confession. Our extant Gospel of Barnabas, leaked by Santorio, was probably prepared in the hope the Colonna could be brought before the Inquisition. The preface was certainly part of this preparation. Other parts of the work may have been too. But what is its value? It's a fascinating work from every point of view. It's a fascinating work in Islam-West exchange, in religious history, as a unique episode in Islamo-Christian polemic. It is also fascinating beyond that frame. It is fascinating as a preservation document. And then there is its quite fascinating intertextuality with the canonical Gospels, as well as the medieval diatessaron tradition, and all the ways it reflects wider streams of unorthodox Christian and Jewish Christian thought. What wider streams? Docetism, for instance. One of the most enthralling aspects of the medieval Gospel of Barnabas is that the author has had to reconsider the entire Gospel narrative and its Old Testament proofs in docetic terms. Docetism is a defined heresy in Christianity, but it is more generally a tendency of errant thought. Amongst other things, it proposes that it was not Jesus who died on the cross, but only a semblance of him. For in the docetic view, Jesus was simply too good to have suffered such an ignoble fate as crucifixion. It was a persistent strain of Christological heresy, and it finds its way into Islam, where Muslims deny the crucifixion and propose that, as per the Quran, one died in his stead. In the Gospel of Barnabas, the Muslim Gospel, which incongruously presents Jesus as the forerunner to Muhammad the Messiah, we have a complete Gospel narrative reconceived in docetic terms. Specifically, it offers the fullest docetic crucifixion narrative in any Christian apocrypha, with the remarkable twist that it is Judas Iscariot, in the image of Jesus, who is crucified, a drama of profoundly mistaken identity. Mistaken identity is a theme in early Christian literature, and wherever it is found, docetism will be lurking not far away. There is a whole body of literature called the Recognitions. It's a genre, and there are recognition episodes found throughout the early Christian ante-Nicene corpus. The problem in this literature is identity. Who is who? How do we recognize someone? It was an acute problem before the era of modern ID. In the canonical Gospels, the Romans don't even know what Jesus looks like. Judas Iscariot says he will lead them to him and kiss him on the cheek in order to identify him. How can the authorities be sure this is the right man? There are no fingerprints, no photographs. It's a theme throughout wider ancient literature and cases of mistaken identity. In this context too, twins and lookalikes enter the story. In general, in the canonical Gospels, Jesus is a mysterious figure who wanders around and has people wondering exactly who and what he is. Very often, even by his own design, he has an ambiguous identity. In the medieval Gospel of Barnabas, God saves Jesus from the cross and has Judas, the traitor, mistaken for Jesus and crucified instead, all the while protesting that the Romans have the wrong man. That Jesus didn't die on the cross meets Muslim expectations. It is a clumsy medieval melodrama, but it conforms well enough to Muslim understandings. It is profoundly docetic. It is an explicitly docetic crucifixion. The apocryphal Gospel of Peter has a docetic crucifixion, but there Jesus feels no pain and doesn't die but ascends into heaven. Again, the idea that he was above that gruesome fate. In the docetic mind, they cannot conceive that an almighty God could ever allow Jesus to be crucified, the cruelest and lowest of deaths. The whole matter was fought out in Christological controversies in the early church councils. The medieval Gospel of Barnabas pulls no punches. It gives a gaudy, almost cartoonish rendering of the Passion. But God suddenly intervenes and sets things right. Jesus is saved, and the villain dies. God is just. It is fascinating to see the author assemble New Testament prophecies and proof texts to justify this docetic narrative. Indeed, there is evidence that the author has devoted great time and thought to such proofs and Old Testament precedents. In fact, there may be evidence of a developed scholarship, which is to say a long docetic meditation upon the scriptures, perhaps a developed heterodox tradition, perhaps the work of people prior to and much better than the author of the extant text. The Gospel of Barnabas, in any case, offers a full docetic reading of the Bible. There is another wider stream. It is very important. It is what makes the Gospel of Barnabas esoteric in the proper sense, and not just peculiar and strange. It participates in a wider underground tradition of unorthodox Christian thought. Let's step back for a minute so that we can see this wider stream. There was, from the earliest times in Christianity, indeed before Christianity, a deep veneration for John the Baptist. John was of the Old Covenant, the circumcised. He was naturally a hero of Jewish Christians in early Christianity. There were also those followers of John who didn't become Christians. There are sects of such people that survive to this day. In any case, the veneration for John took the institutional form in some of the early churches of the catechumenate, a system of initiation culminating in adult baptism. The catechumen was prepared and instructed in stages, and the initiation was understood as resurrection, being raised up from the dead like Lazarus or the widow's son at Nain. This persisted even though Catholic orthodoxy moved to infant baptism. It was standard practice by the 3rd century AD, and resurrection became eschatological rather than initiatory. John was demoted in Gentile Christianity and only makes a brief cameo appearance in the accepted Gospels. So there was a developed system of neophytes and initiates, originally with adult baptism and with the rebirth of baptism as a personal resurrection. The catechumenate system is residual still, but once it was a fully developed system of Christian initiation. For our purposes, it is important to note that this was the case in the Church of Milan. Indeed, St. Ambrose, the early founder of the church and of the Ambrosian rite, was elected archbishop before he was baptized. There were traditions of adult baptism in the Ambrosian church. In the Reformation, it resurfaced. The Anabaptist movement, fundamentally opposed to infant baptism, began in Milan. This unorthodox stream venerates the Baptist, clings to the old law, the laws of Moses, and elevates baptism to a transformative initiation, along with the catechumenate of graded instruction and a corresponding liturgy and ritual. But the church, at an early stage, moved in a different direction. This system becomes dissonant with orthodox norms. In places, the system adapted itself to orthodoxy, and in places it continued underground. All the same, it reappears with great persistence in Christian history. It continued with some comfortable accommodation into orthodoxy, so long as orthodoxy was both broad and slack. It continued especially in places with independent churches able to elect their own archbishops and nurture their own traditions. When orthodoxy became monolithic, this Baptist tradition became increasingly heretical. This is what happened in Milan. The Ambrosian church had its own very rich traditions. The Ambrosian rite, congregationalism, the catechumenate, its own music. In the Counter-Reformation, after the Council of Trent, Rome imposed centralism and uniformity. The Ambrosian Church, like others, maintained its heritage at best it could, but it was forced to conform. Similarly, Cyprus was a theological backwater where unorthodox ideas and practices could persist. The Carmelites had great problems when they fled Cyprus into Europe. For a start, they didn't drink wine. How then could they be Catholic Christians if they refused to partake of the sacrament? And yet they lived in Cyprus for centuries. Cyprus was an independent jurisdiction. In such places, orthodoxy was not so narrowly defined, and heterodox ideas and practices, many of them ancient, could exist and survive within an orthodox framework. Our Gospel of Barnabas, before it was Islamified, is in this tradition. It preserves a body of material purporting to be, in its original form, teachings of John the Baptist. In fact, Jesus is not Jesus in the Gospel of Barnabas. He is John the Baptist. Underneath the Muslim veneer, this Gospel concerns John the Baptist. Much of the other material in the work concerns teachings preparing the neophyte for initiation. The Carmelites were explicitly followers of John the Baptist, an extension from their veneration for Elijah on Mount Carmel. But that's the problem. That doesn't make them Christians. John was of the Old Covenant. The Carmelites got around this by adding a special veneration to the Virgin Mary to Carmelite spirituality, which is one of its characteristics today. When the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land, they encountered a living tradition of veneration for John the Baptist, Jewish Christian, initiatory rather than sacramental. It existed within and side by side more familiar orthodoxy. Heresy, we might say, sheltered under the Saracens. Heresies consonant with Islam, such as Docetism, no doubt prospered. This was one of the themes of the Crusades, to cleanse the Holy Land not only of Islam but of the exotic heresies that flourished among Christians living under the infidels. There were unintended consequences. The Crusades reconnected Roman Christendom with ancient Eastern traditions. Not all of these conformed comfortably with Roman notions of orthodoxy. Encounters with the veneration of John were especially potent. Numerous groups emerged from the Latin Crusader states who had an unorthodox attachment to John. The Carmelites were only one example. Most notoriously, there were the Templars, who were accused of worshipping the head of John the Baptist and of being secret followers of John and therefore not truly Christian. There is an important section of the Gospel of Barnabas that alludes to the early 1300s, the milieu and the papacy in which the Templars were closed down. The secret tradition of the Templars was some version of catechumenate initiation, most likely with Solomonic symbolism. In a later period, this would re-emerge, repackaged in Freemasonry, also accused of worshipping John the Baptist or his relics. There is often talk of Christian initiation. This is the form it took, a persistent Baptist tradition. It survives in residual form, a compromise in the simple expedient of adding adult confirmation to infant baptism. Is the medieval Gospel of Barnabas an esoteric text? Yes, in this sense, but it's not a profound one. It participates in this broader tradition of unorthodox Christianity. John the Baptist, an attachment to the old law, initiatory understandings of resurrection. But someone has matched this with Islam and transformed the material accordingly, according to Muslim expectations, or at least as best the author understands them. Is this a misconfiguration? Not entirely. Islam is itself a somewhat Jewish-Christian affair. There are groups and streams in early Christianity that prefigure the Islamic position. Islam didn't come out of nowhere, and in the Middle Ages, in any case, in fact, up until quite recently, Islam was always understood as a species of Christian heresy, or else Jewish heresy, but a heresy all the same, the heresy of heresies, all the heresies rolled into one. It was never given the legitimacy of being considered a separate religion. We find many proto-Islamic viewpoints in early Christian literature, Docetism for a start. Many early Christian heresies regroup under Muhammad. The Gospel of Barnabas, or its constituent materials, before it was Islamified and made into a Muslim work, was, we can say, a collection of Christian or Jewish Christian materials, heresies, that already prefigured or were compatible with Islam, and on that basis could be rewritten into a Muslim or pseudo-Muslim form. The work is really pseudo-Muslim. It portrays Muhammad as the long-awaited Messiah. That is a profound misfiguration. But the author thought there was enough similarity, consonance between his Jewish-Christian material and Islam. The Carmelite traditions are about the sons of the prophets, for example. They have a prophetology that has been matched to the same perspective in Islam. If our author was a Carmelite, they were already accustomed to thinking in terms of prophets. It is an easy transition to Islam in that sense. The name Barnabas, by the way, seems to carry that meaning here. Barnabi, son of the prophets. That's why Barnabas is connected to the Carmelites. His very name has prophetological associations, from Nabi, meaning prophet. The New Testament tries to deflect this reading, but it's natural for the Gospel of Barnabas, Bar Nabi, to have an emphasis on prophets and references to the biblical sons of prophets, and by extension to depict Jesus, or Jesus John, more to the point, as a prophet in the Islamic manner. So matching this heretical Christian material to Islam is not unwarranted. It is not as perverse as it might seem. We can see the basis on which it has been done. It is fascinating because it unexpectedly shines light upon those aspects of early Christianity, Jewish Christian movements, including John of the Old Law, which foreshadow what eventually gathered into Islam several centuries later. In some ways, the study of Jewish Christian thought in early Christianity always reflects upon Islam, always echoes in Islam. The medieval Gospel of Barnabas is a collection of such echoes. Prior to Tridentine orthodoxy and the enforcement of the Council of Trent, it is very likely that this stream of thought persisted unchecked. In the Church of Milan, for instance, and quite possibly it took more directly heretical forms in private. Santorio's accusations about the Colonna and other powerful families were probably not unfounded, not entirely. Through the long-established connections between Milan and Cyprus and the Barnabas tradition and the Ambrosian catechumenate, the Colonna, the Orsini family, the Sforza, wealthy families, dabbled with or harboured ideas and practices that, to one degree or another, fell foul of orthodoxy. These were family traditions. These were heretical texts in private libraries. These were ancient and important families. Santorio's conspiracy against the Colonna has plausibility. There is a Barnabas cult among these families. You only need to sit outside the Church of St. Barnabas in front of the Battle of Lepanto fountain in the village of Marino and join the dots to see this. That is the message of Fra Marino's preface: an unorthodox veneration for John the Baptist, sympathy for the Old Law, and an attachment to ancient rites of initiation, as well as unwholesome connections to heretical and exotic ideas that are coming into Italy from the East. To be clear, in the bigger frame, these ideas move from the Holy Land to Cyprus at the end of the Crusades. Their heartland is probably Syria, by the way. Then from Cyprus to Italy after the Battle of Lepanto, when Cyprus too finally fell to the Muslims. We're always hard-pressed to see the movements of traditions over centuries, especially where they are shy of orthodox scrutiny and are cleansed by inquisitors from time to time. In this case, the irony is that an inquisitor has been responsible for bringing one of the most heretical gospels in the entire history of heretical gospels into the public domain. What happened subsequently? The plot against the Colonna came to nothing. Santorio never came close to the papacy again. The Gospel of Barnabas was left free-floating without a context. But the Inquisition gained new oversight. The great families cleaned up their act. The Ambrosian Church was brought under Roman control. The Barnabas tradition was squared again with the canonical texts. The Index of Prohibited Books did its work. Private libraries were consolidated into the Vatican Library. Catholic orthodoxy reached a new settlement, now focused on resisting the Protestant revolt and evangelizing the Americas. When it re-emerged among book collectors and freethinkers, the Gospel of Barnabas defied all explanation.